Let me tell you about this man. He's an old State Department hand. He's a senior at the moment. He has just freshly escaped from state, he was telling me tonight, and is delighted to be an escapee. His past tells a lot about him. He's senior associate today at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, working on the problems of post-Soviet successor states. Prior to that, he has a long black record with state. Prior to joining the endowment, Carnegie, in January of last year, he served as special advisor on Soviet nationality problems to the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs and desk officer for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Earlier he worked with Radio Liberty, special assistant for Soviet nationalities in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and a Soviet affairs analyst at the CIA. Trained at Miami University, University of Chicago, he's written more than 70 articles on Soviet national problems. He's speaking on the Russian crisis. Yeltsin, the Russians, and the non-Russians, Paul Allen Goble.
It's always a pleasure to get an introduction like that, but it's also extremely depressing. First, whenever anyone says anything nice about you, there's nowhere to go but down. And second, I hope that I still look young enough that you're impressed by the fact that I have been unable to keep any one job for very long. Moreover, the title that you are promised that I will provide answers to is rather more comprehensive than I think anyone can do in 35 minutes. And in that respect, I find myself in the situation of a student who confronted a final exam at Notre Dame University about 15 years ago. The professor of church history at Notre Dame had asked the same final exam question for 30 years. Namely, he asked his students to discuss the impact of Greek philosophy on St. Paul. Well, students being students, no one ever studied anything else. But in his last year, just before retiring, the professor got cute, and he said, I'll ask a different question. And so when the final exams were passed out just before the professor retired, the question was to discuss the impact of St. Augustine on the structure of the Roman Catholic Church. Well, it took about a minute for the room to empty. But one student sat there for 3 hours writing and writing and writing. And the professor was really interested to see what he might say, because after all, clearly the professor had forgotten to give that lecture, otherwise the students would know. He hadn't caught on just yet. And so finally the student turned in his blue book, and the professor opened it, and there was, on the first page, was written the following. As to the question of the impact of St. Augustine on the structure of the Roman Catholic Church, I shall leave that for others. As for me, I shall discuss the impact of Greek philosophy on St. Paul. I'm happy to report that he got an A, and I hope you'll be similarly generous with me, because I want to discuss a rather narrower topic which has far greater implications than that which the title of my talk may suggest. Now, I find myself in a somewhat awkward position because I am a specialist on the non-Russian peoples of the former Soviet Union, and tonight I want to talk about Russia. Moreover, I want to discuss the extent to which the Russian Federation, a country with 30,000 nuclear weapons, is in the process of falling apart, losing control of those weapons, and setting the stage for a conflict between us and Europe and Japan and China far greater than any we have known. And I do this somewhat literally, because to talk about these things is not easy or pleasant. But I am happy that the Russians have provided a way out. And in a recent issue of the Russian government's newspaper, Rossiyskiy Vesti, it is reported that 10 years from now, in the year 2003, nationalism will disappear in Russia, and that Russia will complete its reformation. But before you get too happy, 2 years later, the United States is going to collapse and to divide on nationalist basis. So we are in a complicated time. Okay. Four days after the April 25th referendum, which voted on Boris Yeltsin's continued stay in office in Russia and on the fate of reform, and where the results seemed to promise, because 58% voted for Yeltsin and 53% voted for reform, that the situation in Russia was going to get better. Russian President Boris Yeltsin told his Council of Ministers the following, quote, "It is no secret that our country is currently gripped by a feeling of anxiety about the integrity of the Russian state. Will it share the same fate as the USSR?" And while Yeltsin was relatively dismissive of this, the fact is that the referendum suggested that the Russian Federation will indeed share a common fate, although the consequences will be very different and very much more severe for Russia's neighbors, for us, and for Russia itself. Yeltsin won his referendum, as the American press has failed to point out, by winning overwhelming majorities in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and his hometown of Sverdlovsk. He lost big throughout the North Caucasus, where he had such winning votes as 2.4% yes in Ingushetia, 14.6% in Dagestan, and where no vote at all was taken in Chechnya. And in the Middle Volga, where only 39% of the Bashkirs voted for Yeltsin, and in Tataria, where only 1 voter in 5 showed up for the election. Moreover, within the ethnically Russian areas, Yeltsin did not do significantly better. Yeltsin won, but not by large majorities, in those areas with significant transportation and natural resource assets, who have benefited by the collapse of Russian state power and are currently moving out on their own and trading with foreign countries. And he lost in every other Russian region. That is not the picture of a successful, integrated state. And these election results reflect a far deeper reality, namely, that in the last 18 months, the 88 regions of Russia, 57 of which are all ethnic Russian, 31 are non-Russian, have passed over 18,000 laws explicitly contradicting central legislation, and not one of those laws has been overturned by the courts or by the force of the central government. That the compliance with the recent draft has ranged from 0 in some areas to a maximum of 20% in others. I would remind you that during the worst years of resistance to the Vietnam War in the United States, draft compliance was over 98%. Moreover, the regions are not sending in their taxes. The best regions are sending in 40%, but over half are sending in under 15%. And the situation has gotten to the point that 6 of the regions are now issuing their own currency. This is not an image of an integral state. And Yeltsin, despite the fact that he was very dismissive in his speech to the Council of Ministers about the possibility that Russia could fall apart, is himself deeply worried about it in fact. Prior to the Vancouver summit, a group of senior Russian officials went to Boris Yeltsin and asked that he request of President Bill Clinton an American declaration that the United States would not recognize any part of the Russian Federation that seceded, because they thought that would slow things up. President Yeltsin reacted to that suggestion about the way I would, namely by noting what good would such an American declaration mean given America's past history with respect to Yugoslavia, for example, and second, why advertise to the world that you are not in effective control of your territory? So Russia is in trouble, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the last great empire, and the collapse of communism were, in my mind at least, enormously positive for the peoples of the world, including the United States. The oppression of communism and the oppression of the Soviet state on the non-Russian peoples and the Russian people as well, we are well rid of. But the approaching end of the Russian Federation, if indeed it happens, will have equally enormous but potentially far greater consequences, because it will not be the end of an empire but the death of a state, something we have not seen in the West since 1918. And it will be a situation in which the state will lose control of the means of mass destruction. That is already beginning to happen, and where those weapons may be used against us or against others or sold to third parties. While no strategic weapons have yet been loosed from the Russian land to third countries, I would remind you that only a couple months ago, the government of China, Beijing, heard that they could buy a cyclotron, which is one of the ways to build a nuclear bomb, in Siberia. And they heard that the going rate was $5 million US. So a Chinese delegation went up to Irkutsk with 2 suitcases full of US dollars, and they offered this to the Russians. When the word got around that Chinese high rollers were in town, the Russians competed with themselves to offer cyclotrons, and the price promptly dropped to $1 million each. The Chinese bought 5, went home, and sold 3. We've just given them MFN, as you know, for another year. The fact is that colonels in the Russian army are currently making $14 a month, and the offer of $500,000 or $1 million for one of the toys on the top of one of those rockets, a Swiss passport and a first-class air ticket out of the country, are going to be increasingly attractive inducements as the situation gets worse. And that's why this evening, instead of trying to talk about the entire former Soviet Union, I'd like to focus on Russia. First, and I'd like to do that by going at it 3 ways. First, by looking at the situation on the ground. Second, by talking about the specific challenges that the Russian Federation faces, because the collapse of Russia, of the Russian Federation, is not inevitable, and it will depend on policy choices by the Russian Federation. And finally, to look at this development in terms of its challenges to the United States. Because while our influence in this area is minimal, it is not negligible, and it could be the difference from things going very, very bad or remaining within tolerable limits. There are many things one can say about the situation of the Russian Federation. I would like to focus on 3. First, the question of economic reform. The collapse of the state structure is creating a new class of winners and losers. You often hear about the mafia in Russia. The reason you hear so much about the mafia is not because in Russia the mafia, like here, the kind of thing we understand by the mafia, exists everywhere, but rather because for most Russians, income, large amounts of income, must inevitably have been gained, people feel, by illegal means. The idea that some person can earn 10 or 100 times more than someone else is a very, very rare cultural phenomenon. Most cultures in the world can't stand it, and therefore when they see primitive capitalism leading to large incomes for some people and small incomes for others, the whole process is labeled mafia. When I was in Moscow 3 weeks ago, I heard a wonderful story which captures this and the difficulties of the Russians in facing up to what is going on. According to the Russians, three good men die: an Englishman, a Frenchman, and a Russian. And they go to heaven, and God meets them at the pearly gates. And he says, since you were such good men, I'm going to give you each one last wish. And the Englishman says, I always wanted to be in the House of Lords. And God says, no problem. And the Frenchman says, I always wanted 3 mistresses. And God says, well, I did promise. And the Russian says, my neighbor now has a goat. Kill the goat. The ability to accept large income differentials is a very rare one throughout the world. It is not something that the Russians have within their culture. Russia has never been free market capitalist. It has never been democratic. And the processes of change to that are going to be very difficult to achieve in the short term. Second, we focus all the time on economic reform, but it is the absence of a political system, of a legal system, which is going to mean that that economic reform will go nowhere. At the present time, there is no legal system in Russia. There are no courts to enforce contracts. Everything is done by bribery. Moreover, you have no ability, if you sign a contract, to make sure that you won't have it overturned the next day by somebody who wants a bigger cut. Moreover, you have no interstate commerce clause, which means that the movement of goods and services across a country that is 11 time zones wide, each district puts its hand out to take a tax, and those taxes can be changed overnight. In one case, they went from 25% of oil flow to 95%, wiping out the neighboring areas. That is a picture without a legal system, without an arrangement to guarantee that the basic infrastructure of capitalism, the basic infrastructure of individual rights will be protected. You have chaos, and that's what we have now. Moreover, the destruction of the Soviet system, the destruction of communism, has meant that the institutions which used to control the situation, which used to hold the country together, the Communist Party apparatus, the KGB, are gone. And in their place, there is typically nothing. The police force in Moscow is currently being paid $4 per person per month. With $25, you own a precinct. In the absence of a legal system, in the absence of law, you will not be able to get to reform. And I believe personally it has been one of our big failures as a country that we have paid far too much attention to economics and far too little attention to the legal infrastructure which makes economics possible. We've ignored that. But the major problem that is going to tear Russia apart is not so much the economic problem of a transition to a market economy or the collapse of a political system, but rather ethnicity itself, both among the Russians and the non-Russians. The Russian Federation, which we all too often call Russia, is neither the Soviet Union nor Russia. The fact that it is not the Soviet Union would seem to be to the advantage of the Russian state. After all, the Russian Federation is over 80% ethnically Russian. That puts it in the top 20% of all countries in the world in terms of ethnic homogeneity. There are only 200 countries, and there are over 6,500 ethnic groups. So that as ethnicity becomes more important, there are going to be more countries. But Russia would seem well placed. Moreover, the non-Russians within the Russian Federation have had significantly less experience with independence, and most of them are not terribly interested in independence per se. But if those are advantages, there are three major disadvantages that the Russian Federation must confront. The first is the problem of the Russians themselves. The basic tragedy in this part of the world is that the Russians haven't got a clue as to who they are. And that's because of their tortured history. The Russian state became an empire beginning in the 15th century, long before the Russian people consolidated as a nation. And as a result, the Russian people never had to define for themselves or for anyone else who was a Russian and who was not, what the proper limits of Russia were, and as a result, the Russian state and the Soviet successor state were a pre-modern kind of empire. That is to say, there was a political center surrounded by a periphery, rather than a metropolitan country with colonies. And the departure of that periphery, which was largely undifferentiated in the Russian mind, has been far more painful than the decolonization that took place with Britain, France, or even Austro-Hungary. A poll was done throughout the Russian Federation at the end of last year. 7,000 people were asked a number of interesting questions. But the most instructive here is that the Russians were asked, what do you think Russia is in its territorial extent? 40% of the sample, 40%, said that the borders of Russia were something other than the borders of the Russian Federation. 30% said that they were a lot larger. Namely, they were equal to the borders of the former Soviet Union. And 10% of the Russians said that the borders were a lot smaller. That is, it was less than the Russian Federation. It was the Russian Federation minus the non-Russian areas inside it. And when you combine that with the fact that the same poll showed that only between 55 and 60% of the ethnic Russians in Russia were currently prepared to defend militarily the territory of the Russian Federation, you have a highly unstable situation where Russians have not accepted the end of the Soviet Union. Many of them look to reestablish the empire, and others are prepared to see the further diminution of the size of the Russian state. If we were to discover that 40% of the American people did not view the borders of our 50 states as an appropriate political division, we would be worried. I think we've got to be worried that that's true within the Russian community. The second aspect of the problem, which makes the Russian problem more difficult today than the Soviet Union has, is that the way in which the Soviet system was designed was to create ethnic minorities, to make sure that every republic was multi-ethnic so that the center would be able to play on those minorities as dependent minorities who would do the center's will and could be counted on to deflect popular anger away from the center. As a result of this policy, at the present time, there are over 25 million ethnic Russians living in the 14 non-Russian states, and there are 35 million non-Russians living outside their home ethnic territories. 60 million people whose position on the map does not correspond to the political lines. And the fact that there are so many Russians abroad has already powered much of the national movement. The fact of the case is that almost all of the leaders of the extreme right Russian imperialist movement are either Russians from outside of Russia proper or non-Russians who have Russified their name. I'm sure you've all heard of Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who thinks that Russia should include not only the former Soviet Union, but Poland, Finland, and Alaska too. And when asked for his ethnicity, he always replies, "My mother was a Belarusian, my father is a lawyer." I'm prepared to buy the idea that lawyers are an ethnicity, but in fact, our friend Zhirinovsky says this precisely because his father is Jewish, and Mr. Zhirinovsky is one of the most vicious anti-Semites on the face of the earth, even though he got some millions of votes for president in the last election against Boris Yeltsin. The problem of Russians outside of Russia is one side of the coin. The other side is the problem of the non-Russians within Russia itself. While the non-Russians form only 18.5% of the population of the Russian Federation, the political divisions, the ethnic autonomies established by Stalin, mean that non-Russians have nominal control over 53% of the territory of the Russian Federation, which of course is viewed as extremely discriminatory by the Russians because it is so out of whack with the population. And that apparent conferring of advantage to the non-Russians is also helping power a national movement. Now, this is a mess. And I have heard the question of the solution of this problem described in Moscow the following way. It is said in Moscow that there are only two solutions to the Russian problem. There is the realistic one, and there is the miraculous one. In the realistic solution, Jesus Christ and the 12 apostles will come down from heaven and arrange things. In the miraculous one, the peoples of Russia will do it themselves. Well, what are the miracles we might expect? What are the policy challenges that Boris Yeltsin must confront in trying to hold this situation together, in trying at least to manage the devolution of power from Moscow to the society and from Moscow to the regions? Unfortunately, to date, President Yeltsin has not adopted a policy which has promoted the integration of Russia, but has pursued a series of policies which are accelerating the disintegration of the country. And as we'll see in a few minutes, the United States is pursuing a series of policies at the present time, which, despite our professed aim of securing the integrity, territorial integrity and stability of the Russian state, are doing almost everything to undermine that integrity and to unleash forces in the world which I believe will recreate the 1930s, but this time with nuclear weapons. And if you did not like the original film of the 30s, you will not like the remake. In attempting to deal with the loss of empire, Boris Yeltsin, in an effort to appeal to Russian sentiments, has called for the adoption and world recognition of a Russian Monroe Doctrine, of the idea that Russia has a right to use its military force in the name of co-ethnics abroad, the 25 million Russians outside of Russia, and that these military forces can be used at Moscow's discretion without the consent of the governments of the 14. Seeing the success of Mr. Milosevic of Serbia, who has used force outside his country, aggression in the name of defending ethnic groups, and the West's willingness to accept that, indeed to strive to legitimize it, has meant that those Russian liberals who oppose Mr. Yeltsin's effort to make this claim on the international community have very few legs to stand on. Within the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin faces, as did Mikhail Gorbachev before him in the former Soviet Union, three different kinds of ethnic challenges, and the tragedy is that except at extremely high levels of coercion, the solution to any one of them will tend to exacerbate the other two. And adopting a policy of multi-tiered federalism which grants different rights to different groups will set in motion a bidding war, a political bidding war, which will tear the Russian Federation apart just as the Soviet Union was. These three kinds of ethnic problems are, first, the demands by a limited number of ethnic communities for independence, full independence. This is mostly concentrated among the Muslims of the North Caucasus, the Chechens, the Ingush, the Adige, the Muslim populations of the Middle Volga, the Tatars and the Bashkirs, the Tuvans, a Buddhist group along the Sino-Mongolian border, and the Buryats, who are also Buddhist and live out there. The departure of Tuva and Buryatia will be of interest only to me, stamp collectors, and those State Department officials who get sent out there. The departure of the others will have much more major consequences, because the departure of the North Caucasus would cut Russia off from the oil supplies of the Caspian, and the departure of Tataria and Bashkiria would cut Russia's pathway to Siberia and the Far East, and probably presage, as we'll talk about in a minute, the exit of a number of Russian regions beyond the Urals. That's one kind of challenge. Another kind of challenge are those small ethnic groups with political recognition, that is having territories, or without it, that is not having a territory but having an ethnic identity, who just want to be treated better. Some of these are the small peoples of the North, the 26 Eskimo, Inuit-type populations stretching from Lapland to Alaska. They have good reason to hate the Soviet and Russian state. In 1959, these populations were forcibly sedentarized by the Soviet population, and their diet was changed from the fish and meat of hunting and fishing communities to essentially milk products. It turns out that these people are among the most lactose intolerant in the world, and life expectancies promptly dropped from 63 years to 39 years, with infant mortalities over 400 per thousand in the first year. These people are not real pleased with what's happened to them. Moreover, we are going to see that the environmental disaster visited upon that country by Soviet power was so terrible that Murray Feshbach's recent book, Ecocide, will in 5 years look like a whitewash. It's really very bad. More important, probably, are those large ethnic communities with co-ethnic groups abroad. You've seen a lot of the struggle between Russia and Ukraine over nuclear weapons, over Crimea, over the Black Sea Fleet. And every few weeks, the struggle heats up and everybody's predicting war. Why doesn't it happen? Well, part of the reason it doesn't happen is because while there are 11 million Russians in Ukraine, there are 6 to 8 million Ukrainians living in Russia. And these Ukrainians in Russia happen to live in important places. 400,000 of them sit on top of the major oil supply of the Russian Federation in western Siberia, and the others sit primarily out in the Russian Far East around Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and Nakhodka. Indeed, the Russian Far East is viewed as so Ukrainian that one Ukrainian official recently suggested that there should be created a Far Eastern Ukrainian Republic, which he proposed connecting with Ukraine proper by a 10-kilometer wide corridor. Lord Owen and Cyrus Vance have plenty of work ahead of them there, too. This proposal, mercifully, was promptly denounced as the dumbbell proposal, and I don't think we're going to hear about it again. But whenever the Russians have gendered up the pressure against the Ukrainians have taken to quoting Vladimir Nabokov's novel, Penin. Penin, as you'll recall, was an émigré Russian professor who learned English but never quite got it right. And so he would butcher American idiom. And one of his favorite sayings, which the Ukrainians have now elevated to their state policy, goes like this. The Ukrainians now say to the Russians, "People who live in glass houses should not try to kill 2 birds with 1 stone." Which explains part of this complexity. At the present time, the non-Russian countries, the 14 former Soviet republics other than Russia, are providing cultural institutions, schools and other things, in a variety of languages. In the Russian Federation, no such effort has been made for many of the groups, especially those without their own territories. And as a result, this is a serious problem. And the third issue is the question of Russian territories themselves. The 88 regions of Russia, the 57 of which are almost all Russian, and many of the 31 non-Russian territories are heavily Russian as well. As the state has collapsed, as the Russian Federation in Moscow has become a shell, these regions have moved out on their own and are forming associations from below. There are now 8 major regional associations. The 2 most important are the Sibirskaya Soglashenia in western Siberia and the Dalnovostochная Associatia. These institutions now have their own foreign policy, conduct their own negotiations, and increasingly have entered into negotiations with the Russian military, supplying the Russian military with food and electric power, which Moscow is not in a position to pay for given the collapse of the tax system, in exchange for the agreement of the Russian military to protect those elites. A country that is refederalized from below is a country that is in grave danger of splitting apart. Boris Yeltsin, after coming to power after the fall of the Soviet Union, said in January of last year that he would like to see the refederalization of Russia from above, dividing Russia into 8 to 15 large German Länder-style states. He quickly backed off on that because the non-Russians saw that as a threat to them and promptly introduced declarations of independence within the Russian Federation, and the Russians saw it as an attack on existing elite privilege. As a result, he has backed off. But now we have a situation where Moscow's ability to control these various regions is extremely limited. We are currently in a state, in a few weeks, we will have a constituent assembly to draw up a constitution. You've all read about this. There are 2 different drafts. Both of them would take power back from the regions. But the regions are getting used to having the power. Moreover, the regions under Yeltsin's plan are going to be the delegates in this constituent assembly. It isn't going to work nearly as well as people think. We'll come back to that. Okay. The Russian government is failing. Not just because of Boris Yeltsin, not because of the parliament, but because it is such an enormous country that has gone through such a trauma of loss, that has seen the institutions which held it together destroyed, and which is no longer in a position to guarantee much of anything on its territory. That poses an enormous challenge to us, and that's what I'd really like to focus on. What I would like to do is to make 3 points. First, the most important thing we can do is to understand what's going on here. Because if we don't understand what's happening, we will certainly get the policy wrong. The second is that we need to adopt in foreign policy with respect to this region, as well as everywhere else, the Hippocratic principle of do no harm. Do not conduct policies which subvert the very purposes you claim to be for. And finally, and this is the most important thing, we need to recognize that the Russian Federation is dissolving, but the Russian Federation and something called Russia will be reconstituted. And that 10 years and 15 years from now, we will be confronting a major Russian state. Now let me suggest a little bit more detail about each of these. It's been complained that America doesn't have any foreign policy goals. The problem is not that. The problem is that we want too many things all at the same time. In the best tradition of teenagers, we want it all and we want it now. We want Russia and these other countries to be democratic, to have free markets, and to be stable all at the same time. We haven't decided what we care about most. And so we are pushing all of them, not recognizing that each of them, each part of that thrust tends to subvert the other two. If we care about stability, we will back one kind of government. If we care only about free markets, another, because free markets do not necessarily lead to democracy. And if we care about democracy, we will pursue yet another policy. We need to recognize in what we do that this is not a Marshall Plan situation. That the Marshall Plan was the perfect American foreign policy enterprise. It was expensive, it was short-term, and the people we gave the money to knew how to spend it better than we did because they'd been free market and democratic only 5 to 10 years earlier. Democracy and free markets, as we understand it, are very, very rare. There are only 7 countries on the face of the earth that have been continuously democratic for the last 100 years. 7. And most of them speak English. And free market capitalism of the kind we understand is almost as rare and does not necessarily overlap with the same 7 countries. That we have to understand, and I don't think we do. Second thing we have to understand, America is the only place in the world right now where you can make a fortune by writing a book with the title, The End of History. We like to proclaim the end of history, and what's left is us. The processes that tore the Soviet Union apart are continuing to work. Today, I would remind you, is the 517th day since the end of the Soviet Union. That is a very short period of time. And you needn't be as arch as the Chinese leader Zhou Enlai was when he was asked about 20 years ago, what was the impact of the French Revolution? And he replied, it's too soon to tell. To realize that the forces at work that tore the Soviet Union apart are going to continue to operate. They're not going to stop just for our convenience. The third point of understanding is that we've got to get over our obsession with looking only at the center, with looking only at Moscow. I used to tell students who were studying the nationalities that if you wanted to find out about American sexual behavior, it might be useful to read the Village Voice personals columns, but that you would not want to predict behavior in small-town Iowa on the basis thereof. I guess I'm wrong by this point, but it seemed like an important point in the 70s. Our obsession with looking at Yeltsin versus the parliament, at looking only at Moscow, is to get it wrong. The struggle between Boris Yeltsin and Ruslan Hasbulatov of the parliament is something like the struggle between the captain and the first officer of the Titanic. It matters marginally who's at the wheel, but the boat has already hit the iceberg. And unless we look beyond that, we're going to get it wrong. Because we have to recognize that what we have in Russia is dual powerlessness, with neither side having the ability to punch the other side totally out. Moreover, were either side to win, were the liberals to simply win or the conservatives simply to win, it would fragment the country. If the liberals win, the party conservatives in many Russian areas will decide to leave to defend their privileges. If the conservatives win, many of the non-Russians will leave lest they be oppressed again as they were under the Soviet system. And some Russian regions, particularly the Russian Far East, will decide to leave lest they be suppressed again. We need to understand, in short, what brought the Soviet Union down. There is a view that the Soviet Union was destroyed by Gorbachev's liberalization. Wrong. The Soviet Union was destroyed not by Gorbachev's liberalization, but by his turn to the right beginning at the end of 1990. And by the fact that people realized they had to get out to defend themselves. Under Gorbachev, people like to quote Alexis de Tocqueville's observation that the most dangerous time for a bad society is when it first begins to reform itself. That's not true. The most dangerous time for a bad society is when, having begun reforms, the leadership loses confidence in those reforms and tries to pull back. And the people who have benefited from those reforms, in the absence of any structures to protect themselves, decide they have to leave. That's what destroyed the Soviet Union. That's what can destroy Russia with either a sharp jump to the right or to the left. Now, we have to recognize that our ability to affect this situation is extremely limited. The amount of aid we're talking about, if you say $1 billion, it's a lot of money. It works out to about $3.30 for each Russian. One of the things we've got to be concerned about is putting our priorities in order and realizing that there are things we can do. The first thing we can be very clear about is that we accept the borders of the Russian Federation as real borders, as a Russian state as a real state, and her neighbors as real states. Not as branch offices of Moscow, as we have tended to treat them, but as real countries. And to resist those efforts by Russians to suggest that the 14 non-Russian countries aren't real countries. That means opposing the Commonwealth of Independent States, an institution whose initials CIS should in every case be followed by the American words boom, bah. It is not an institution that should be kept going. First, because it has the consequence of seeming to provide encouragement to the extreme right of the Russian people that they will be able to retake the empire. And second, and more seriously, because the Commonwealth of Independent States is the greatest contributor to the breakdown of the chain of command in the Russian army. Some of you will have worked in a bureaucracy. Short of retirement, the bureaucrat's ultimate goal is to work for two bosses. Because if you work for two people and you're clever, you don't work for anybody. The Commonwealth Ministry of Defense, headed by Marshal Yevgeny Shapashnikov, represents a parallel chain of command to the Russian Defense Ministry chain of command. Every Russian general, every Russian colonel is under a dual command. And dual subordination leads to insubordination. And that is an extremely dangerous thing when you're talking about a country with nuclear weapons. We can be very clear about that. Second, we need to recognize that what we have not done in Bosnia has consequences in this part of the world. By failing to defend against Serbian aggression, we have sent a signal that we will not oppose aggression by any large country to defend its co-ethnics abroad. I promise you that the language of ethnic cleansing has already passed into the Russian parliament and into some members of the Russian government. And the idea of using military force to defend co-ethnics abroad is already there as well. The Russians are watching what's happening in the former Yugoslavia, and they are drawing conclusions. They are not alone. The use of the Russian army in the Transdniester region of Moldova, a region which is only 24% Russian, already sets the stage for a potentially bloody battle which could tear the country apart as well. In thinking about our foreign policy, I'm not suggesting that we need to intervene militarily everywhere. But we need to recognize the decision we are in the process of making by default. There are fundamentally two kinds of foreign policy you can pursue, grosso modo. First, you can decide to allow regional powers, big regional powers, to dominate their regions, and you stay out of it. The other is you pursue a balance of power politics, where you intervene as Americans as a countervailing force, a counterweight defending the weaker parties in these conflicts so that the bigger parties do not decide they can get away with aggression. The first kind of policy, when it has been pursued, has in every case led to major wars, because it leads to the conflicts coming with big countries dominating small ones, and then those blocs coming into conflict with each other. The balance of power politics is the only way that you can prevent small conflicts from growing into big ones. Right now, to the extent we have a foreign policy, I'm afraid it falls into category 1 rather than category 2. There's a very high risk, has very high risk for us. And last, under what our role, let me suggest to you that there are specific American policies which are being adopted right now which are cutting Russia apart. Let me give you my favorite example. As you know, Japan has been very reluctant to give Russia aid because Russia still controls 4 groups of islands, either the Northern Territories or the Kurils, depending on who you want to listen to, that were seized by the Soviets at the end of World War II. The United States has now forced the Japanese to come up with $1.8 billion of aid. The Japanese have reluctantly agreed, but they have said that all of their aid will be funneled into the area of Russia east of Lake Baikal. That is the area between that big lake in the middle of Siberia and the Pacific coast. That area, which is relatively underpopulated, has most of the natural resources you could possibly want. And Japanese aid is going to go in there to develop oil, gas, iron, diamonds, gold. And the incomes of Russians in that area, if Japan invests in this way, will go up in the next year or two to 250 times per capita the incomes in central Russia. I put it to you that if Californians had incomes per capita 250 times the rest of the country, California would think about leaving too. Some of us would be pleased. But that will tear Russia apart, and Russia will lose another set of ports. But more seriously, it will mean that Japan will be back on the continent of Asia, just as it was in the 30s, and that Japan will be detached from the Western Security Alliance because it will get all the oil, gas, and raw materials it needs across 250 miles of the Sea of Japan, rather than from the Middle East and needing to rely on America's deep-water Navy. That will reduce Japanese interest in containing China and will allow the Chinese to move south to the Spratlys and the Straits as a political force. As I say, if you didn't like the 1930s the first time, you won't like what's coming unless we reverse course. And finally, what I've described tonight about disillusion is not the end of the story. The Russian Federation and Russia will be back. It has enormous natural resources. It is an extraordinarily wealthy country, potentially, with an extraordinary population. But the process by which it will be reassembled will consist of elements from 3 things. First, economic advantage. Second, ideology, probably nationalism. And finally, coercion. You may have noticed the economy over there isn't too good. You may have noticed that the only ideology that's readily available is a kind of Russian nationalism, which is rather aggressive. And you may have noticed that in the past, Russia has a history for using force to hold things together. Whatever we do, we are going to see a Russia reemerge that is probably going to be less democratic, less free market, and less friendly to us than we would like. We've got to recognize that we can be partners in some things, but not in everything. We are competitors. We have different histories, we have different geographies, and we have different interests. If we think we are going to agree on everything, we are going to be sadly wrong. The competition between us and the Russians did not start because of communism, and it will not end with the death of communism. In 1876, 41 years before the Bolshevik Revolution, the great American political cartoonist Thomas Nast drew one of his most famous cartoons. It showed a globe on which on one side was Uncle Sam, on the other side was a Russian hussar. And underneath, Nast wrote, 2 young giants. It is now almost 120 years later. Both of us are a lot older, maybe even middle-aged. But only the next few years will show whether both of us are wiser as well. Because unless we get this transition right, and vastly more right than we have so far, and that goes for Moscow as well as Washington, the potential for sliding down toward a world where we could easily get in a major war is all too real. And I hope that that won't happen. But it won't happen only if we take the problems seriously and begin to address them before they get entirely out of hand. Thank you very much.